Welcome to the third panel in the Niche Arts-Based Research Series. This online series is a continuation of the conversation started by my co-host, Amrita Dasgupta, with the Niche Arts-Based Research Anthropocene series. The blog series aims to probe the limits of what are acceptable methods of data collection and offers new pathways to think through what counts as evidence and data. Amrita asks us to question the traditional ways of doing research, to break down the field boundaries, and to move towards an interdisciplinary approach. So today, we're going to focus on representing through drawing. And you're going to find the blog post from the series in the chat box. So feel free throughout the session as you're listening to place your comments or questions in the chat box for the question and answer at the end that Amrita is going to facilitate. So I'm Nuala Kruvnak. I'm the Niche New Scholars representative. I'm an evolutionary biologist at the American Museum of Natural History in New York and currently finishing a PhD at New York University on conservation law and Madagascar. Oh, oops. Did something happen there? Weird?
I think the
That's
recording.
just the backup recording on Zoom that I forgot to
Okay.
unpause.
Like,
so we're still live on YouTube. Everything's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Amrita, to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Nuala. And before I start, I wanted to thank Nuala and Jessica for supporting me with putting this together. I am also very thankful for the contributors of the blog series for which we stand here today. I'm Amrita Dasgupta. I am a final year PhD scholar at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and I work on trafficking of the climate exiles in the Indian Ocean deltas and use arts-based research like arts workshop and ethno-theater in place of interviewing as a decolonizing method for my PhD. Thank you, and Jessica, I'll pass it to Jessica for her introduction.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I am Jessica DeWitt. I am the co-editor-in-chief as well as the social media editor for Niche. So I take care of a lot of the behind-the-scenes work at our organization. And I am an independent scholar and environmental historian of Canada and the US. And it is a pleasure to be at this third panel. This has been a wonderful series. So.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks, Amrita. So our speakers today are Elsa Barron and Beth Shepherd. Elsa Barron is an environmental peace and security researcher, writer, poet, and youth activist. Her advocacy has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Rolling Stone, and the Christian Science Monitor, among others, many other things. She has been an observer and speaker at multiple international conferences, including COP27 and the Geneva Peace Week. Elsa graduated from the University of Notre Dame, where she studied peace studies and biology. Her work is based on the firm belief that a secure, peaceful, and sustainable future is possible. Our second speaker today is Beth Shepherd. So Beth Shepherd is a white settler living and learning in Ottawa on traditional Anishinaabe territory, where she's a visual artist, environmentalist, and animal advocate. After a career in business and technology, she reinvented herself as an artist, taking studio art courses and studying art history at Carleton University, which culminated in a master's degree in 2020. She also holds degrees in psychology and biology and currently undertakes interdisciplinary art research projects that are provocations to industrialized and consumerist systems. These projects address industrialized animal agriculture, the urban water system, environmental degradation, and diversity loss, climate change, and currently regenerative agriculture. So thank you so much for both of you for coming to chat with us this evening. This is very exciting to have you here on this panel. So without further ado, I'm going to start some questions. So Elsa and Beth, how did you come to envision these projects? And in essence, how does it fit into your sort of broader research interests? So I'm going to start with you, Elsa, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having us both here today, and to the whole team that just introduced yourselves. It's been lovely to work with each of you in the process of contributing to this anthology and the many events that have come out of it. And I think it's really introducing new conversations that don't always happen easily in this space. So it's just wonderful to have. In terms of how I envisioned my project, so I was initially living and volunteering in Bethlehem at in Ida refugee camp at a center, a community center there with a number of different programs, youth programs, language programs, education programs, community health programs as well. So it was a really innovative center, and also environmental ones. And there was a rooftop garden and a children's garden. And the majority of what I was doing while I was there was cleaning up the gardens, learning about local environmental conservation histories and experiences, and how it was being practiced today in a very sort of condensed urban setting that had not been planned when it was initially built, because it was intended to be temporary housing for refugee communities that turned into a much longer settlement when communities were not given the right to return to their original lands. And so that was sort of like the landscape of where I was living and learning and working. And I got really interested in how other organizations were conceptualizing environmental issues, especially as I began digging deeper, not only into conversations with colleagues and into literature, but into the environment itself. So at one point when I was working in the children's garden, and sort of digging through some weeds that had built up and needed some work, I uncovered a tear gas canister that had just sort of gotten buried there and left behind. And it just hit me really, really strongly in that moment to realize that this is a space, supposed to be a safe space, a community space, where children come to play. And I'd heard from folks at the center that there were times during the Second Intifada in particular, in the West Bank, where children were tear gassed while playing in that garden. And so to sort of uncover it and see the physical evidence of that was really powerful. And then a second sort of physical evidence, the water tanks that are often used in order to store water in case of shutoffs, which do happen quite often in that community. You can see like bullet holes remaining from the Second Intifada, where water tanks were often shot out as a way to put additional pressure on communities. And so as I was working on environmental restoration and conservation and doing so in an urban setting, it became really clear that there was more to this story, and that there's a longer history of violence and how it intertwines with the environment. And so that sort of set me on a path of interviews and just trying to understand how different organizations in Palestine and Israel conceptualize their environmental work, and also their peace building work, and what, how that all fits together. And I ended up doing this research and also experiencing a number of relationships and emotions and experiences that felt like they couldn't be put down so clearly into academic literature. And so I also started writing poetry reflecting on this experience and in follow-up trips to the region. And that's really how it got started. It was very evolutionary, but it's great to see how it has turned into a reflective piece. And unfortunately, I think that the emotions continue to evolve and develop as I stay in contact with folks that I have built relationships with in the West Bank, as they sort of experience what is happening tangentially in Gaza and also how it's affecting them. So I think that there could be an entirely, new direction that this kind of work and project takes in the future.
Well, thanks, Elsa, for sharing that. That's like, I love the idea of the evolution of this and the story. This is quite a complex story. I'm excited to hear more about it as we continue this conversation. Beth, how would you describe your sort of project as you envisioned it? Was it kind of a very similar path as Elsa's, or very different?
Very different. Thanks, Elsa, for the work that you do. It really is remarkable. And mine is certainly not as courageous as yours, but I thought I would just share the screen. I put a few slides together because what I've done, it's less of a single project because I happen to write the article that got chosen for or in the blog. I had just started to use concrete poetry as a tool in my research creation, toolkit, and so that's what I was really writing about. So it was more than one project, really, because I use poetry in parts of things. So let me just share this and. So first of all, I just wanted to say that I've been using text and in my art, in many forms of art, and obviously from these are largely my my animal advocacy work, but it did become more profound as I moved more into my environmental work as in response to COVID. So so using text was not new to me, but in 2017, I decided to really try to do a poem. Now here I'm kind of in much of my art, I emulated artists and I put animals and other themes in it. So this is, I've taken a couple of Marc Chagall's whimsical work and I've made it about the hormone replacement industry where they use pregnant mare urine to actually manufacture hormones. So this is my first poem. So mare standing in dark stench, her foal's cry fade then gone, his life worth less than PMU. It is what it is. And I actually, and you can kind of see it on the bottom of the painting, because I find sometimes that when you're making art, art is really something that the viewer can interpret. Well, if you're making advocacy type art, you would at least like to give a hint of what your intention is. So sometimes it's not clear. So I thought in this piece, which, by the way, I wasn't particularly pleased with the result, but it is the example of my first poem. So that's why I've included it. The next one I did kind of a Dadaist kind of poem where I was talking about the loss of the ability of our Indigenous peoples to control their lands and to really keep it safe. I had just read an article about some people in South America being shot down when they protested some mine, probably a Canadian mine project. So I'm just flipping through these just to show you the trajectory here. And this is the one I actually started talking about in my article. And this is what I'm talking. I decided this met the criteria for what I was thinking of as concrete poetry. It's text that's kind of taking the, a shape. And it's the shape that's important. I ended up all of these that if you actually could read that text that's very small there. It starts off with a horizon. Each phrase is horizon is, and it gets progressively more filled with, it starts off very pleasantly and then goes to talking about climate change, how it's a horizon, and it's not going to be a pretty thing when we get there. So it was that kind of sentiment that I was trying to build in that, and I use that as the soundtrack for my video. The next one, I had moved on. Of course, I do many projects. There are multiple projects. I do a lot of science research. And one of the ones when I was working in the Ottawa River, I didn't even know that the American eels were being extirpated. 99% had been lost because of the hydro dams. So and they suffer terribly when they go through the dams. And so I wrote a poem to the silver eel. The silver eel is the mature eel that after 10 or more years tries to come back down the river and gets caught in the turbines. So I didn't write it at first as a concrete poem, but then I realized I could easily kind of shape it and make it very much reflective of the work of the words and sentiment. So that is so there I had two things in a row. And then I actually set out to write. This is a poem I wanted to write for a long time because I live right by the Ottawa River, and you can see the river cutting through the limestone. And it really is a neat place because we've lost, the bedrock is 450 million years old. And then you've got the topsoil that came, after the glaciation, 10,000 years ago. So there's a lot of time missing there. So I've always been fascinated by that. So I wrote that again. I made that about climate change. And then, so from 2000, so my poetry was always about angst, it was all this really bad stuff. So I said, you know what, in this new project I'm working on, I've been working on it since 2020. I just have a plot at a local farm and I grow beans. And I'm trying to use regenerative organic agriculture. And I said, why don't I just lighten up a bit? And so I'm actually trying to learn how to write real poetry, and I'm using it to experience outside myself. What is it like to just live underground for imagine that. So that's the poem I'm actually struggling with right now. So I've written a few other poems, but I'll stop sharing there because I'm not trying to get you to read my poems, but that's how my project of poetry has progressed to answer the question.
Thanks, Beth. Wow. This is absolutely incredible. Like I'm sitting here in utter awe of like the scope of both of your work and the approach to these very complex or complicated issues. So it leaves me wondering how it relates to or complements or is in tension with your own personal politics and how that plays into what you're trying to do through your art. So I'm going to start with you, Elsa, if that's okay. If you'd like to unmute yourself so we can hear what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that, both Beth and I included poetry in our submissions, but I'm hoping I can quote another poet and a poem that has really impacted me. So this poem, which I first learned from a professor of environmental justice, is by Solmaz Sharif. And it goes, a lover once. You can't say every action is political. Then the word political loses all meaning. He added, "What is political about this moment? I was washing his dishes. I had left the water running." And this poem has stuck with me, for a couple of years now, and I think really intertwines as well with some of the themes I engage with in my poetry and in the research that I did in Palestine, which is that there are many political acts that we undertake daily that we might not even recognize as political. And I remember when I was working at or researching and sort of volunteering at another organization, which was a little bit further outside of Bethlehem, a farm, so a more rural environment. There was no running water, period. It had been cut off by the military for security reasons, quote unquote, along with electricity. So this farm was operating entirely off the grid. They had to ship in, all of their drinking water. And by ship in, I mean like on the back of their truck. And used rainwater for most other things like washing dishes or hands. And so I remember washing my hands with like a trickle of like water just dripping out of the faucet bit by bit, and thinking of this poem and how political it was that I was here in the West Bank on the ancestral lands of Palestinians for generations that's disputed, and that there's no water access, and I'm using this rainwater like drip by drip, and in contrast to not only how I would behave in different steps away from this. So like, what if I was in Jerusalem, sort of one border over, I'd have access to as much water as I wanted. And what if I was back home, in the comfort of my home, showering with boatloads of warm water, and realizing how political those actions are, even though they're embedded in daily life. And so I think like today, the politics of what is happening in Palestine and the sorts of widespread displacement and murder of Palestinian communities, to the real extent of genocidal tactics, the politics of that is so overwhelming, but it really also layers into even the everyday actions that have been sort of the norm for years in this part of the world, that so many people have become comfortable with. I'm including myself. We're comfortable with a lot of power imbalances, with systemic violence and oppression. And Beth, I appreciate that you are engaging in this like hopeful form of poetry. And I think that's very important even in this moment, as we sort of hold all of these truths together, as a motivating factor to keep advocating, to keep putting ourselves in those positions of challenging the norms and challenging the assumptions, and being the unfortunate person who makes things political that could easily slip into the day-to-day, because those are important realities to confront and address, and not just allowed to be the unsolvable. And so I think it's really embedded into my politics, and I'm continuously trying to challenge myself to stay engaged and to stay serious, and aware, and hold the gravity of what is happening, while also continuing to find ways to do something about it.
Thanks so much, Elsa. Beth, do you want to share with us your...
Yeah. Of course, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and it was a pretty political time. There were all kinds of different causes. And then when I went into my, get married, have kids, have a job mode, I really trusted that our government would take care of things, and I really trusted the system. And so it really wasn't until kind of this big rush of activity was over and I stopped to, smell the roses or whatever, that I realized that our generation, the baby boomers, had dropped the ball. We had such high hopes, with feminism, anti-racism, stop the war, save the environment, save animals. We had all those kind of causes, and yet nothing was as I thought it should be. And so through my art practice, I started discovering all these things, and I use my art to really dig into stuff. And it's ended up that this probing has it has really affected me because we become vegan. We do all kinds of things that are very, I guess, different from most people our age. And so my life is political. My art is political. My life is political because I do both of them 24/7, So yeah, it's different kinds of politics, but it's that politics of consumers, consumers and just people. We are so lucky, if you can call it that. I always say being born when I was, where I was a real gift. And so I think it's good to be political, though.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate both of these very sort of different journeys to, as you kind of straddle and move across these political spaces. And Elsa, I really appreciated you mentioned about sort of the sort of daily tasks or the daily moments. And it certainly seems that for both of you, that there are moments in time where you yourself are kind of put in a place where you have to constantly think about your position, where you are, what you're doing, and the challenges around that. And so it leads me to thinking about like this idea of mixing like poetry or your arts in the broadest sense with academia. So like, how was your journey through that? And then would you be able to share your process? Is this something as someone who doesn't, know much about poetry at all, this is like fantastic talking to you. Like, are you just always in your head then all the time? Like where do you place all these words and stuff that come out? So if you don't mind sharing some of your processes of how you come to produce these beautiful pieces of work. So Elsa, I'm gonna again start with you, just Beth doesn't have to talk twice.
Yeah, no worries. I appreciate the question. I think that I would say like I'm also still early in my academic journey and my career journey and my life journey, hopefully. And so I think that I've had early on some great mentors who really encouraged the idea that arts and academic research could be very intertwined. And I recognize that that may be an unusual experience to really have that valued before I even necessarily considered doing it myself. And so I even had classroom experiences where the final product of the course was a mixed methods product where you could, do writing, but also integrate images and poetry and mix that with the prose. And so I think that that was really encouraging. And I think it's also a sign to educators who might be, interested in this conversation or listening that I think introducing those sort of innovative opportunities in the classroom can have a big impact on the way, students coming up into the world perceive even what creates knowledge and what is classified as knowledge. Another big theme that I touched on quite a bit in my coursework on environmental justice and climate change was the fact that, science for so long has really disrespected in many ways ancestral knowledge or oral forms of tradition, and really only allowed for the scientific method to produce truth. And the fact that in many cases that has led to oversight of what is best for communities and what is best for environments and ecosystems as well. And the fact that there is real value in upholding different forms of knowing and different forms of knowledge. And so I think, and I hope that in many ways this conversation is shifting, and that there are so many new opportunities to think differently about academic research. In my case, I think it's really amazing to have this conversation now, because I sort of first published the poetic version or some initial reflections on my research, and then just recently published an academic journal article on the same body of work. And so to have those two together and to know that the poetry really came first is, I think, a great example that I'll be continuing to share, and has really shaped my journey of producing the journal article as well. So I hope that I can continue to use that method going forward.
That's fantastic, Elsa. And if your journal article is out and you have a link, please do share it with us in the chat. That'd be fantastic. And if not, you can give it to us another time. We'll send it out. So Beth, over to you. What's like your journey seems just fascinating as Elsa's, of like, I know there's lots of stories there about your
Yep.
process. I want to hear them all. This is great.
Well, I'll start with, of course, having biology and psychology degrees, and a lot of technical stuff in between there. It really wasn't conducive to what we would call research creation. When I started taking art history, I first of all, I mean, I've always loved art and art history for all my life. When I was a little kid, I could draw very well, and people would say, "Oh, are you going to be an artist?" And I went home to my mom and dad and I said, "Am I going to be an artist?" And they said, "No, you're going to get a real job. You're going to be a scientist." So, which I also was not. But so I ended up at art history. You know, I love going to galleries all my work life, and so I had an idea in my mind what art history was. Well, it didn't turn out that what I was learning was not what I really expect to. So what I did is I started using art to actually teach me the art history I wanted to know. I wanted to know about the artists, what they were making, and so this is. I also happened to I started doing my animal advocacy. So I for 5 years, I worked on a very big series I called Pigs in a Postmodern World, which is over 50 masterpieces that I painted with inserting pigs in them, with the idea the pig is the poster child. And so this was all done while I was taking courses at Carleton. I was doing this part-time until 2018, when I actually decided to do my master's. And so it was a wonderful project. So, but of course, it was on my own. There was no such thing as research creation. I did get to do a self-directed study where I documented my work on this project, but so it wasn't until after I actually graduated from with my master's in art history, and I came across, or I got this notice from Carleton University from Steffi McGrath, who had just started this thing called Proto Hive, which was about this research creation. I had no idea what it was, but I said, I've been doing that since 2011, you know, so I contacted her, and through her, well, not through her, but through other connections, Jessica, Jessica, are you still on the call? Jessica Barr? I met a couple of other ladies who had studied with Steffi that are all experts on research creation. So we kind of hooked up, but I don't want to go back and do another degree. I just like to do my own thing, you know, but I do follow along the process. In fact, I don't want to get too scientific. So that's one reason poetry is helpful, because I was starting to write essays and I felt I had to do all this fact checking and everything. And I said, this is getting to be too scientific. If I wanted to do science, I would, you know, go do something else. So that's why I'm here at poetry now.
This is so fascinating. I do have to ask you to, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about the concrete poetry, because I was really struck by the fact that, like, Elsa, you're using haikus, and Beth, you use concrete poetry, and they both have very particular forms and structures. So Beth, if you don't mind talking about the concrete poetry, and then I'm going to swing by you, Elsa, to find more about these haikus.
Okay. By the way, I wrote my elegy for the silver eel in as haiku, but in multiple haikus, and then I put it together and changed it into concrete poetry. So concrete poetry is it depends on how rigid you want to be. It's either the specific work that started, you know, around the 1950s, or if you think of it more as shaped or visual, then in fact, it extends back to the Middle Ages. You know, there's a lot of history of shaped poetry. And I realized that I kind of prefer shaped versus concrete poetry, which really, concrete poetry really is more about the placement of words on a page, and then and it's the juxtapositioning of those that give you, you can derive a meaning. But I find it often, like, you know, we're so used to things that are just kind of you know, almost gimmicky. So I find some of it gimmicky, but some is very beautiful. I saw some, unfortunately, I don't know the artist's name right now, but she did this plastic poem, which she turned into a video, which just had plastic going around and around and around, like a gyre, you know, which to mimic the plastic that is forming in the ocean. So although the only word was plastic, I really felt that, and it could be seen as a bit gimmicky, but I said that is so powerful. That is what concrete poetry is really about.
I appreciate the explanation, because it's very striking. Like in your blog post, the pieces, they're so striking. It's hard to not be pulled into them and drawn into them.
Thank you.
And then Elsa, would you share, you know, the reasons you were drawn towards the haiku format? And if you don't mind explaining a little bit, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also took a lot of interest in the concrete poetry, so I'll be looking into that more. I wish I could say that it was like a very intentional selection of the methodology in starting to write haiku, but I have to admit, I think it was very reactionary to the kinds of writing and production that I was being sort of asked to do in my professional life. And I think probably a lot of academics and researchers can resonate with sort of the need to churn out information and words and do it very fast, and maybe faster than the process really requires. And so I was writing just tons of words a day. And by the end of it, that I felt that I still had thoughts that I wanted to process and express that were more powerful than even the research I was writing and doing, but that I was kind of at a loss for words to keep going. And that's when I thought about experimenting with haiku as a very structured form of writing that required so few words. Not to say that a lot of thought doesn't go into producing those words, and sometimes it's harder to narrow it down. The structure of the haiku is based on syllables, and it's 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and 5 syllables to follow. And sometimes it's more challenging and takes more time to express the thought within that constraint of syllable. But I felt like it was a really beautiful and intentional process that maybe I was lacking and responding to in other areas of work and writing. And then ended up just really sort of falling into a pattern of it for a while, where I was, at first it was slow, and then I was sort of getting the hang of it and like writing haiku in the middle of the day when they just like came to me, or I was like falling asleep and was like, oh my gosh, there's a haiku, I have to write it down. So it was just really interesting to see how that process worked. And I basically had a personal journal that was exclusively haiku for over a year period. I've sort of transitioned out of doing that 100%, but like I have many more haiku that are just scribbled in there that have never seen the light of day or have been shared with family and friends. But that's really how I came upon the method. And I think it's encouraging too. I mean, for people who are interested in incorporating more art into their work and into their life. And I would put myself in that category. Like it sometimes feels like you have to set out with a clear intention and sort of know where it's going to take you. But again, for me, just like for the research, it was a very evolutionary process, responding to kind of what I needed in the moment. And trusting in that, I think, is the first step forward.
Wow, I have so many questions for both of you. This is like just such a journey for me to listen to you, to hear about how you are piecing this all together for yourself, as you know, as a space of, as you know, to use your word, Elsa, as like an evolution of yourself over time, and to see how you're expressing it. So it does lead me to think about like what kinds of sort of interdisciplinarities are you trying to reach here? Whether it's research wise, you both have talked about the sort of rigidity and the formula itself of science, or the scientific method, or scientific knowledge production. So I'm thinking about in terms of sort of both in pedagogy and research wise, if you would like to share a little bit about that. Beth, do you want to go for next, just because Elsa just finished chatting?
Sure. Well, science is my big go-to, although, you know, agricultural science and agricultural economics are also big on my list. The art history, eco-criticism are the and more now creative writing. I took a course at Carleton just last year on creative writing, and it really opened up my eyes. You know, it's like every time you I feel that creative writing today holds a lot of value in terms of really understanding climate change and the problems, and being able to do something, because climate change and other problems in the world are, but especially climate change, happens so slowly that we can't really grasp it. So creative writing starts to help us feel, and art as well, of course, that's the purpose. But we can always just say, oh, well, that's not my fault. I don't have an impact here, or I'm going to, that won't bother me in my lifetime. But sometimes having a creative writing or visual art or poetry can help people see things and change lives. So I think it's that connection between the world of science and fact, and being being able to really get into people's minds. And we often do that through entertainment, right? That's where a lot of people spend a lot of money and a lot of time, is on entertainment. So that's when their defenses are down. So it's actually a very good time to really try to get understanding, to open a space for people to understand things. So remember, disciplines have only really been around about 100 years, right? Before that, a scientist was, could be a poet, he could be an artist. Mainly he was a he, that is the bad side of it, but it was much more fluid. So I'm glad we're getting back there.
Me too. This is fantastic. Elsa, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I really resonate with what Beth shared, and I think that a lot of the same themes of climate change and sort of the science of climate change, but how that's connecting with specific local environmental challenges that may be caused by climate change and then caused by other factors, and then the political aspect and the sort of critical aspect that falls more under realms that could be classified as political science, or peace studies is sort of where I approach this from. And then connecting it with the art can be quite a few different steps that sometimes it's like, oh my gosh, that's too many things. But what I found, just the more that I've studied climate change and studied it from different angles, from the scientific angle to the more social and political angle, that so much is systemic and sort of patterned in many ways. And I've done faith-based advocacy on climate change and really resonate with the idea that it's a spiritual crisis, regardless of like what sort of tradition you're coming from and what you bring into that statement. I think a lot of people resonate with the fact that something systemically is broken, and that it reflects on the state of our well-being as individuals, as communities, as a society, and that sort of transformation or transformative change to reconcile the wrongs of this crisis really involves everybody, and it's not just the scientists. And there are so many different ways to get involved and to really think about this crisis and work together on solving it. And that doesn't have to mean, continuing to increase our consumption with some carbon offsets along the way. I think it is more transformative than that, and it really does implicate and involve everyone. So I think that concept is catching on a little bit more, but often I still get very confused glances that I have to, work on really explaining how climate change might connect in these more non-traditional ways.
Yeah, I can imagine the the experience of trying to reach across into those spaces to explain these alternative approaches to thinking about this sort of global crisis. So it leads me to one of my last questions, because we're coming up on the hour. I would love you to talk about any sort of projects that you're, grappling with at the moment, or you're hoping to do in the future. And of course, we would love to know how people can join you in your work and the ways we can sort of like support each other and make these new connections. So, Beth, I'm going to pass this over to you, and then I'll pass it over to.
Well, I'm continuing with two projects, and they're both already started. One is the is regenerative agriculture in plot 46. And the other is the eel and the river. And they both, I kind of cover, and I don't mean this because I'm a vegan, surf and turf kind of thing, is because I live right on the river, I can't abandon the river. And although I do really like what I'm doing at the farm, because the reason I like that is because it is peaceful. And it's a positive. It's really, I have no idea whether it's true, but people are saying, scientists are saying, agriculturalists are saying that regenerative organic agriculture is a great way to alleviate and deal with climate change. And so I say that is good, because it's good to be working on solutions instead of on just worrying about the angst of the situation. So that's what I like, and I'm taking time now to actually look at poetry. It's one thing to say I'm doing, concrete poetry because it's visual, but I really wanted to learn some of the ins and outs of poetry, because there are many wonderful people that write wonderful poetry. And I would at least like to, first of all, read their poetry better and then write some of my own. So those are the kinds of things that I'm planning for the future.
Thanks, Beth, for sharing that. Elsa?
Yeah, I appreciate the chance to share and to think about the future too. I will say, if anyone is interested in getting involved specifically with any of the organizations I've worked with in Palestine in particular, I would be happy to make those connections or build those connections. And there's often a lot of work to be done, and a lot of witnessing to be done. And so I've often heard from some of the leaders I've worked with there that come and see is really their mantra, and they really, really need people to simply see what is happening and their experience and bring that into the work that they do. So there's a lot of openness and opportunity to get involved if anyone is interested in that. In terms of what I'm thinking, and areas of exploration in the future, one thing I'm really focusing on and have increasingly focused on over the past 3 years is the UN COP process and the climate negotiations at an international level. And I'm gearing up for COP 29 already, and bringing a cohort of sort of first-time COP advocates each year. And that's a really beautiful experience and process to sort of build a network and a cohort and get people inspired to take what they learn at this global conference filled with people working on climate change back to their home communities. And that's through a faith-based initiative called the Christian Climate Observers Program, which I think brings a lot of value to a space that can get monotonous sometimes. And then further, I'm interested in researching this space of international climate diplomacy, especially with the introduction of loss and damage as a policy framework that has sort of an accountability structure built in. And I'm interested in sort of comparing and considering how truth and reconciliation processes that have happened at a local or a national scale might provide some insight into what we can do as an international community on the issue of climate change that has, real-time perpetrators, you might say it, and also those who are most impacted. So that's what I hope to explore in the future.
Well, these are all very fantastic projects, and definitely excited to see where you both go with them and follow along. That sounds very creepy, but to see the kind of art that you produce as you go along with this journey. I have one more question, but I'm going to actually hold off and just pass it over to Amrita if she wants to take any of the questions that are in the chat box.
Nuala, we don't have any questions in the chat box yet, but I think we are doing great and we have most of the answers that perhaps we would be looking for, be informed about. So yeah, move forward with your last question.
Thanks, Amrita. So my last question is mostly as your blog pieces and your art, the poems are absolutely incredible and very extremely generative. You can sit with them and think about things, and I really like that as provocations. I think they're really important, and I think what you're doing is really important work in terms of trying to split apart these very rigid spaces with to do with climate change and so forth. The question I have for you is really, as you both talked about these moments in time where, Elsa, you talked about the water faucet, right? And the sort of drip of this water, and sort of there's a moment where, and I'm sure we all have these kind of shared experiences where we sort of think more deeply about something that we haven't thought before, right? We're able to just turn on the faucet and there's water, and suddenly there's not, and you have to think about that world that you're in. And then Beth, for you, it was so fascinating to hear about the promise that you grow up with, right? Like you mentioned about the trust in sort of government or the state, and the fact that you were part of all these moments in time where it was about civil rights or feminism or the environment, and it was all very, very hopeful and all very, coming together and sort of collaborative. And the question I have is really, is there anything that you would love to share? Because we have you both here, that kind of, as you went along with your journey, that kind of surprised you or shocked you or made you laugh out loud or made you rage at it at that moment when you sort of were confronted with it. And it could be anything from an image you saw or something you witnessed, Elsa, or something that Beth you discovered along the way that you were like, wait a minute, that totally goes against what I thought I knew and stuff, like you'd mentioned about the eels. So if there's anything of the human or non-human world that sort of really resonated, I would love to hear a story about that. If you can conjure up one on the spot, as I'm putting you on the spot here.
Do you have one, Elsa?
I think I need a minute to process that. If
yeah, that's a lot I just threw at you. So
I have one. It's not really a story, but it is something. I'll tell you that, because I know I'm so much older than everybody else, but I'll tell you, we were getting towards year 2000. And I had a contract. I was one of those IT people that were going around making sure that the numbers were all right, so they, had the 4-digit year in and stuff like that. So, but I was very, very hopeful about the age of Aquarius, things were going to be better. It was just going to be wonderful. And then, of course, first of all, there was a political shift in the United States. And then, of course, we had 9/11 and the world changed. So my age of Aquarius did not happen. And then I kind of started looking for all the flaws and holes. And that's when I began to find that the system that I thought was working really wasn't. And that I love there was a Pogo cartoon. I don't even know if you remember it, but we saw the enemy and the enemy was us. And that was the big aha moment that I suddenly realized that our consumerist society was the problem. So that's my big aha.
Wow, no, that's a huge, I appreciate you sharing that story. That's a huge aha, like that, the sort of broken promise, right? I think it's very hard, that sense of betrayal. So thank you for sharing that. Elsa, if you don't have a wee story, that is totally fine too. I did put you on the spot.
No, I thought of one. I appreciate you, Beth, for going first. And I'll go back to my time living and volunteering in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and I was working at a liberation theology center as well for some time as a part of this extended experience. And I was always learning surprising things in that context. And one was, and I think this connects to art, and we've sort of been wrestling with this tension of beauty, even in the midst of like really serious and heavy weight of these future challenges and the challenges we face today and the weight of injustice, with the beauty that sort of persists in that and the art that comes out of it and the garden that continues to grow and produce these beautiful things. And one thing that really surprised me working at this center was the amount of like humor and levity that was brought in instances of like really challenging dynamics, and the stories that I got to learn from people who had come into this liberation theology center and share about their life and their experience and their work confronting injustice. And one story in particular has really stuck with me and reminded me of maybe some of the shortfallings of my perspective as an American when I enter certain spaces. But there was a story of this tour bus, and it was part of a dialogue program. So half of the group was Americans who had come for this educational trip to the region, and half of the bus were Palestinians who were sort of accompanying them on this journey. And they stopped in a field to sort of look at some of the local plants and the ecosystem there. And the military didn't know who this group was, but started shooting into the air as sort of like warning signs. And the Americans like ran for cover in the bus, and it was the scariest day of their life. Some of them shared, and it sounds terrifying. They really thought that they were being shot at, whereas the Palestinians who were there started collecting some of the local greens that were in season, and we're so used to and so accustomed to these sorts of warning shots that they took it as an opportunity to like pause and do some harvesting. And so the two groups came back to the center, and one was just completely horrified and terrified, and the other was like really excited about dinner. And the guy who runs the center was just telling this story to share both, the impacts of chronic stress and trauma, but also the impacts of like your perspective on how you perceive a situation and the way that you might imagine opportunity, even in the midst of like these really serious challenges. And the image of that story like really struck me, and sort of the levity in the room when it was being told, and the understanding of people who had experienced similar things, that, you know, yeah, that's how you would react because it happens frequently, I think is an interesting and really telling truth on our perspective, and the way we can be creative and see things differently, but also support each other in sort of the challenges we face.
Wow, thank you both so much for sharing these stories, especially with this like on the spot question. So it's a lot to process, which is always great to think about, like things like the humor or levity that's used, or like those moments where like your angst and frustration, and you're like things newly discovered that you're like, how did I not know this? So I want to thank you so much, both of you, for this amazing panel, and this has just been like super interesting and generative, and I just want to see what you end up doing. This is like brilliant. And before I pass it over to Amrita, I just want to thank Amrita for organizing this incredible panel and the series and the blog. And of course, thanks to Jessica for being, you know, like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, just like making sure this all operates. So thank you to you both. Amrita, I'm going to pass it to you for some final goodbyes.
Thank you, Nuala, for coordinating and moderating this session. And thank you, Jessica. And I remember we had Andrew as well as Heather last year, who helped with bringing the blog together. So thank you to them too. This wouldn't have been possible without the continuous effort put by the members of Niche, as well as the continuous effort, the back and forth with the editing and the wait times related to the publication, you know, the contributors who were so very dedicated to the process. I really appreciate all of it, and I'm really grateful that we were able to bring together the blog post series as well as these panels to start a conversation, you know, very difficult conversation related to arts-based research in the traditional disciplines, and how to do it, how to merge the political, the personal, as well as the professional, the academic through art. And yeah, so thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for having this conversation and adding to the scholarship that existed, and for adding with your personal experiences, and for making it a space where, you know, we could come forward to share more and safely. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amrita. It was nice meeting you, Elsa. Bye, Nuala. Those were great questions.
Thank you so much for organizing and making this happen, and good to